Most of the videos you'll find about diabetes talk about your blood sugar, your feet, your kidneys, and your eyes. Almost none of them talk about what diabetes is doing to your brain, and the reason that matters is because the brain damage starts years before you notice anything is wrong. It happens so gradually that you'll blame it on aging or stress or just not sleeping well. And by the time someone finally connects it to your blood sugar, a significant amount of the damage has already been done quietly, in the background, without a single obvious symptom to warn you. That's not meant to scare you. That's meant to make you pay attention for the next few minutes, because what you're about to hear is the information that should be part of every single diabetes conversation, and almost never is. And more importantly, there are things you can do about it right now that are surprisingly simple, but only if you actually know what's happening in the first place. So let's start with the thing that stopped me cold when I first came across it. A research team used brain scans from over 20,000 people between the ages of 50 and 80 and compared the brains of people with type 2 diabetes to those without it at the same age. What they found was that the brains of people with diabetes were aging 26% faster than they should be. A 60-year-old with diabetes had a brain that looked and functioned more like someone years older, and the longer they'd had the condition, the worse that gap became. The patterns of damage were almost identical to what happens in normal aging, the same regions shrinking, the same connections weakening, the same processing speed slowing down, except it was all happening on a faster timeline, as though someone had quietly turned up the speed on a clock that was already ticking. And here's the part that most people never hear. The researchers said that by the time diabetes is formally diagnosed through the usual blood tests, the brain may have already sustained damage that you cannot undo. The standard tests your doctor runs are looking at your blood sugar and your pancreas. Nobody is looking at your brain. There is no scan, no routine screening, no red flag on your chart that says something has been going wrong upstairs for years. But it gets more unsettling than that, because a separate study out of Australia took a group of 249 people in their early 60s who were completely healthy. None of them had diabetes. None of them were even close. Their blood sugar was in the normal range, and they scanned their brains and then scanned them again 4 years later. The people whose blood sugar was on the higher end of normal, not high, not diabetic, just higher within the range that every doctor in the country would call fine, had measurable shrinkage in the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that processes and stores memories. That's the same region that shrinks in Alzheimer's disease. And these were people nobody was worried about. The lead researcher said something that should have made front-page news. He said the definition of what we call normal blood sugar might need to be completely re-evaluated, because normal might not actually be safe. So what is diabetes actually doing inside your brain that causes all of this? The simplest way to understand it is this. Your brain runs on sugar. It is the most energy-hungry organ in your entire body, using roughly 20% of all the fuel you consume, and it depends on insulin to help it absorb and use that fuel properly. When your body becomes insulin resistant, which is what type 2 diabetes is, that resistance doesn't stop at your muscles and your liver. It reaches your brain too. Your brain cells become less and less able to absorb the sugar that's floating all around them, which means they're surrounded by fuel they can't actually use. They're starving in the middle of plenty, and when brain cells can't get the energy they need, they start to misfire. They stop communicating with each other properly, they become inflamed, and over time they begin to die. A researcher at Rutgers compared it to the telephone game you played as a kid, where one person whispers a message and by the time it reaches the last person, the message is completely garbled. That's what happens when your brain becomes insulin resistant. The signals between your neurons start getting lost, and the conversations your brain cells need to have with each other for you to remember a name, find a word, hold a thought, or learn something new become less and less reliable. And this doesn't show up as some dramatic event. It shows up as the kind of thing you shrug off, walking into a room and forgetting why you went in there, struggling to find a word that you've used your entire life, reading the same paragraph 3 times because it won't stick, feeling foggy after meals, losing your train of thought in the middle of a sentence. Every one of those moments might be nothing. But for someone with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, those moments might also be the surface ripples of something happening much deeper. And the fact that they look exactly like normal aging is precisely why nobody connects them to blood sugar until it's much further along than it needed to be. There's a phrase that some researchers have started using that I think everyone with diabetes or prediabetes deserves to hear. They're calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. Not officially, not on your medical chart, but in the research because the connection between the two has become so strong and so consistent that it's getting harder to treat them as separate problems. People with type 2 diabetes have roughly a 73% higher risk of developing dementia. Some studies put it at double the risk. And people who are diagnosed with diabetes at a younger age have an even higher risk than those who developed it later, which tells you that the total number of years your brain spends bathing in poorly controlled blood sugar is one of the biggest factors determining what your mind will look like at 75 or 80. And it's not just one thing going wrong, it's several things happening at the same time. Your brain has a protective barrier around it, a kind of security system that controls what gets in and what stays out. It lets nutrients through and blocks toxins and inflammatory cells from entering. Diabetes damages that barrier. It starts to leak, and when it leaks, inflammatory proteins that were never supposed to reach your brain tissue get through and begin triggering the same kind of toxic protein buildup that researchers find in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. At the same time, diabetes is damaging the tiny blood vessels inside your brain, causing what doctors call silent strokes, small blockages that don't produce any symptoms you'd recognize as a stroke. No drooping face, no weak arm, no slurred speech, just tiny areas of brain tissue quietly dying off one by one over months and years, each one so small you'd never know it happened. But together they add up to a slow erosion of the brain's wiring. On top of all that, depression is 2 to 3 times more common in people with diabetes, and it's not just because living with a chronic disease is hard. The same inflammation that damages your brain cells also disrupts the chemicals that regulate your mood, which means the low energy, the irritability, the feeling of not being yourself that many people with diabetes experience isn't a separate problem. It's the same problem showing up in a different room of the same building. Now here is where I need to tell you something that changes the entire picture, because everything I just described sounds like a slow, unstoppable slide, and it isn't. A massive study out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden that followed over 31,000 people found that yes, diabetes and even prediabetes are associated with accelerated brain aging, but they also found something that should give every single person listening to this a reason to act. People with diabetes whose blood sugar was well controlled had brains that looked about 1.5 years older than their actual age. People with poorly controlled blood sugar had brains that looked over 4 years older. That's a gap of nearly 3 years of brain aging determined entirely by how well someone managed their blood sugar. Same disease, completely different outcome depending on what you do about it, and the study went further. People with diabetes who maintained a healthy lifestyle, they didn't smoke and they didn't drink heavily, and they stayed physically active, had significantly less brain aging than people with diabetes who didn't do those things. The lifestyle didn't erase the effect completely, but it cut into it substantially, which means your daily choices are actively shaping how fast or how slowly your brain ages with this condition. Exercise may be the most powerful tool of all, and not for the reason you'd expect. A study at Rutgers took 21 people with prediabetes, whose average age was 60, put them through just 2 weeks of regular exercise sessions, and found that the number of brain-released particles carrying insulin sensitivity proteins increased after the training. Exercise directly improved the brain's ability to respond to insulin. Not over months, not over years, over 2 weeks. And a walk after a meal, even just 10 minutes, doesn't just lower your blood sugar in the moment. New research using genetic data from over 350,000 people found that the blood sugar spike that happens specifically after eating is tied to a 69% higher risk of Alzheimer's. Not your fasting number, not your average over 3 months, but the spike that happens in the hour or two after you eat. That's the window where the most damage is being done to your brain, and a short walk right after a meal blunts that spike more effectively than almost anything else you can do. If you watched our earlier video about the food industry and diabetes, you already know that eating your vegetables and protein before your carbohydrates reduces that after-meal spike by about 29% with the same food on the same plate. You already know that a tablespoon of vinegar in water before a meal slows the speed at which sugar hits your bloodstream. What you didn't know until right now is that those strategies aren't just protecting your blood sugar numbers, they are protecting your brain. Every spike you prevent is one less assault on the neurons, the blood vessels, and the protective barrier that are keeping your mind intact. For anyone currently taking metformin, there is news that should matter to you. A 2026 study published in Nature found that metformin shows the strongest neuroprotective potential of any diabetes medication studied so far for reducing Alzheimer's risk, and longer treatment duration was associated with greater risk reduction. If you're on it, that's one more reason to stay on it. If you're not on it and you have type 2 diabetes, that's a conversation worth having with your doctor, not just about blood sugar, but about your brain. And the Mediterranean style of eating built around vegetables, olive oil, nuts, fish, and whole grains has been shown to slow cognitive decline, specifically in people with type 2 diabetes, not in the general population, extrapolated to diabetes, but studied directly in people with the condition. Real food protects real brains. That message keeps showing up no matter which direction the research comes from. Here's what I want you to walk away with. The most important organ in your body is not being included in the conversation about diabetes. Your doctor checks your blood sugar, checks your kidneys, checks your eyes, checks your feet, and rarely checks your brain or even mentions it. But the damage happening there may matter more than all the rest, because your kidneys can be supported with medication, your feet can be monitored, your eyes can be treated, but once you've lost significant cognitive function, the road back is much, much harder. You are not powerless in this. The research shows clearly that how you manage your blood sugar, how you eat, how you move your body, and how quickly you act on what you know directly determines how much of your mind you keep as you age. Nobody built this system to tell you that. The food industry doesn't benefit from you understanding it. The healthcare system doesn't routinely screen for it. But now you know, and knowing is where every good decision starts.